Tēnā koutou katoa and hello everybody. Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. My name is Ben Adelberg and I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Tēnei ka mihi ke te mana whenua o Aotearoa, and we acknowledge the local tribal authorities of New Zealand.
And g'day, I'm Emma Strutt and I'm currently coming to you from Dalrymple Country in Queensland. Before we dive into our conversation today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And finally, if you like this potty, please like, share, subscribe, comment on our social media and consider buying us a coffee to help support our work. Now on with the show.
In our last episode with Nathan Surendran, we mentioned that degrowth is going to be a hot topic this season, and we will have many more of those much needed conversations. This episode takes a slightly different, or in our guest's words, unconventional perspective at the topic, and we're very excited to have another member from the Degrowth Aotearoa, New Zealand, who will talk from a societal community angle.
That's right. So today we're super excited to be talking with the fantastic Sahra Kress, who is a core committee member at Degrowth Aotearoa. Sahra loves discussing how everything fits together from a dynamic system perspective, and we're really looking forward to chatting the ins and outs of degrowth and what community resilience in that transition process might look like under this model. So as Ben alluded to, Sahra brings a wealth of life experience to our chat today, much I'm sure will come out in the conversation, but notably Sahra is also a midwife with an avid interest in working with birthing women in resource poor countries and communities. Thanks so much for joining us, Sahra. Looking forward to this chat.
Oh, kia ora, you guys. Thanks so much for the opportunity to discuss these things.
We are here. What our listeners won't realize, it's taken us close to 40 minutes to work technology out, which is quite ironic considering technology is kind of at the center of or part of this whole degrowth problem, issue, solution. I don't know what we call it. Anyway, Sahra, as Emma's mentioned, you have a fascinating background. So, of course, we want to hear all about it. Tell us about some, I'm not going to say all because it's going to be a long story, but tell us about some of your life stories, some of the experiences that have brought you to where you are today.
Oh, well, yeah. Thank you both so much. And I just want to pause really in the beginning and just thank you both for having these conversations, because I think bringing these concepts and ideas into a wider awareness is just critically important in these times. So I do have a lot to say, and the challenge for me will be to keep limited tonight. And I think, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of my background personally, because I think personal stories and kind of the journey of where we arrive, where we are, is always interesting. And then I will talk a little bit about the definition of degrowth to give our listeners a bit of a definition. And then I'll tell you a little bit more about how we approach degrowth from our perspective and our approach, because it is a very, very broad movement. So I think we always need to own that, our approach is not the only approach, but it's certainly a very exciting time for us. So how did I arrive here? I do have an unusual background. People are often confused about where I'm from because of my accent, but I'm originally from Germany. Both my parents are German, and my father was a physicist and worked in complexity and chaos theory. And because of his work, we moved to New Mexico when I was quite young. I was about 4. And so I grew up in the Rocky Mountains of New Mexico and went to an unusual school. I went to a Steiner school, a Waldorf school, which is very holistic. And my mother is a teacher, so I was raised in a quite a simple sort of, connected way in a small school. And when I finished that school, I was 14, and I just couldn't imagine going into the mainstream, going into high school, largely because of some books that I was reading at that time that had to do with limits to growth, actually. One really significant book for me was Daniel Quinn's Ishmael, and it had a very impacting influence on me. And I started thinking about the industrial society that we live in, and was incredibly disillusioned. So I left school, and I went into the land above my parents' house, which was kind of national forest land in the Rocky Mountains, and built myself a little cabin up there with their permission, and under the guise of sort of homeschooling myself. And while I was there, I was reading about the Amish as a group of people, a community that didn't go into the kind of industrialized society, largely because of religious reasons, but also a deep distrust in the kind of acceleration of the machine. And so I wrote to an Amish community at age 14 and asked them whether they would be open to have me come and help really on their farm. And to my astonishment, they wrote back and welcomed me, actually. So I took a Greyhound bus from New Mexico all the way across the United States to Michigan. It took me, I think, 3 days, and I spent the night in a bus station in Chicago. And this was really the first time that I had left New Mexico. And so I was pretty overwhelmed by the overwhelm of the kind of American sort of society and the speed of things and the racism that I witnessed on that trip. So I ended up staying with this Amish community over 2 summers. And while I was there, I helped with everything, really, with the family. They had 5 children. And while I was there, the mother, she was pregnant with her 5th child. And because of the laws in Michigan, it was illegal to have a home birth. So in this community where there was, very strict rules around modesty and, community values, because of the laws, she actually was taken out of the community into a modern obstetric hospital to give birth, even though it was her 5th child. And so I looked after the children. She went into the hospital, and it was incredibly traumatic for her because, of course, there were male doctors, and she was on an operating table to give birth, even though it was a completely normal physiological process. And I was horrified. And I really got to that point where I thought, if I ever have to have a normal job, then I want to be in a position where I can offer safe medical care to women wherever they are in childbirth, and not to take them out of their communities unless there's risk. But if it's just a normal physiological process, then she should be in the circle of her community, and the safe medical care should be there for her in her context. So that planted a seed in terms of midwifery. And also I was thinking a lot about transition states and just the enormity of impact that the kind of foundation of a mother's love has on the child's life. And having come from a really nurturing family, I saw my sister being born at home when I was 6, and I had really vivid memories of my mother, in the throes of labor, and the trauma of seeing that as a child, but then seeing also her courage and the utter joy when the baby was born, when my sister was born, and that gave me this sort of insight into what it's like to engage with suffering and struggle, and to have the courage and the love around you to move through that, instead of having anesthetics or drugs to try and make it better, but actually to have courage and confidence to do that. And then the incredible joy and overwhelming love and reward of having gone through such a challenging experience on the other side. So it had a big impact on me, seeing my sister born and seeing the incredible joy. I remember running outside as a 6-year-old and being so overwhelmed that all I could do was just gather armfuls of sunflowers and, come and just lavish my mother with flowers. And it was such a incredible joy to see the relief of having that transition state navigated in such a powerful way. So when I left the Amish community for the second time and went back to my little cabin in the Rocky Mountains, I was herding goats and making goat cheese and was living up there. I spent 4 years on my own, reading everything I could get my hands on in terms of literature and the Russian classics, and basically ended up taking a so-called high school completion test just to demonstrate that I had kind of done some sort of homeschooling, and I passed that quite easily. So I had a high school certificate, even though I had basically not really done conventional schooling at all. And when I was then 19, the situation changed and I actually had to leave that land. And so I was then faced with re-engaging with the system. And so I decided that I would go into the heart of the system and flew to London. And I was challenging myself really to see whether I could stay true to my values of simplicity and connection and love, the things that I had really found meaningful, even within the kind of rush of society. And so I enrolled in a course at Emerson College for a year, studying history of culture and with a lot of art involved. And took that year to really think about this question of, if I need a career, if I need to have a job, a proper job in this society, then if it is to be a midwife, where would I study? Because, of course, in the United States, midwives are very rare and they have a lot of limitations. And so I researched about the different options, and actually in Holland they've got a great system, but I don't speak Dutch. And so what I found in my research was that actually New Zealand has got an amazing midwifery system here, because it's based on continuity of care, which means that one midwife will look after the couple from conception all the way through their pregnancy, their birth, and then 6 weeks after the birth. And so I was so convinced about the need to support the entire journey that it was clear to me that New Zealand was very progressive. It was publicly funded. There was a great education system here. So I came to New Zealand. So that's the story of how I got here. And I enrolled in university, even though I didn't have proper high school qualifications, and got accepted immediately at every university that I applied to. So then I had a choice to study here, and had a very interesting degree, and was offered a mentorship in a community midwifery practice here in Kapiti. And this was 19 years ago. And I thought that I would start by working here for a year just to consolidate my skills. But my vision was really about working with resource-poor communities, simple communities that needed expert medical support. And so I always thought that I would end up going to Africa or some so-called developing country. But my family were here now as well, and I met my partner, and so I just got very grounded in my practice here, and ended up working with Maori women up in Otaki. So it's a community just a little bit north of here, 20 minutes from where I live. And I really loved working with teenage mothers, and then I ended up working with a bunch of gang girls, and just absolutely loved looking after young women and Maori traditional birthing practices. And then I decided that I did need to also have the more adventuresome experience. So I ended up going to Papua New Guinea then a few years later, and working in the hinterlands of Papua New Guinea, which was the sort of life experience that is actually hard to describe if you haven't experienced it, because it's such a very, very different world. I flew into Port Moresby and then had to wait for a week until some little bush pilot was heading into the highlands, and we ended up, taking this tiny little plane and landing on a grass airstrip, which was actually more big mud puddles than anything. And I had actually made contact with a New Zealand doctor who was way up at this health camp, which is actually the most remote so-called hospital in the Pacific. So after landing on this tiny little grass airstrip, we still had to go up a river in a dinghy for 8 hours in order to reach this little so-called hospital, which was really just a collection of grass huts way out in the jungle, and there were no roads, there's no electricity, no running water. But this remote hospital was serving a huge population of indigenous people who would come and have all sorts of extreme infections, and they needed amputations, they needed all sorts of stuff. So I stayed at that hospital and thought that I would be doing, midwifery, but ended up having some extremely unusual experiences with, needing to sew an arm back on, and, trying to diagnose appendicitis without a scanner. And I mean, it was just doing the best we could with the resources that we had. And so life-changing experiences and memories that I'll never forget. And so then I came back to New Zealand, and over the next sort of 10, 15 years, I ended up just doing various trips back and forth. I never stayed for a huge long placement because I loved my practice here in Kapiti so much. So I would go to Vanuatu, and I did a lot of teaching of emergency skills, obstetric emergency skills. And then my trips, I went to the Solomon Islands and was teaching there in a program for health workers. And then the last trip that I did was in 2019, and I actually went over to the Solomon Islands again to do quite an extensive research study on access to family planning, contraception for women there, because a lot of the deaths that we were seeing in mothers was actually women that were having, their 6th, 7th, 8th, 10th baby, and they were dying in childbirth from hemorrhage, and they didn't want to be pregnant. And so offering them contraception was actually a way of preventing maternal death, because if you don't get pregnant, you can't die in childbirth. So the research study was incredibly interesting, and we went all around the outskirts of Guadalcanal in a little dinghy, and the local communities were just so welcoming, and the research was really in very close partnership with them. They ended up directing it really, and I just wrote it up, and then we published in a journal. So it was incredibly meaningful and satisfying. But the last time that I was there, I had never sort of lost sight of the wider ecological crisis, and flying back and forth was becoming more and more difficult for me emotionally. Just that sense of contributing personally to the environmental problem. And during that trip, I saw the coral that was bleached, and I just really came to this conclusion that I just couldn't fly anymore. I really couldn't be complicit with the enormous emissions and supporting the aviation industry like that. So I came back to New Zealand in 2019, and with this real commitment that I actually just need to work locally. And as much as I love midwifery, I also felt like the amount of dedication that I had put into supporting mothers to be empowered through their birthing experiences so that they felt really confident and really engaged with claiming their baby, that sort of bonding that enabled the love, that sort of fierce maternal love, to be uninterrupted. I really started thinking about the earth is our mother, and we are the children, and what are we doing to our mother? And so I really wanted to do more activism and advocacy beyond just protecting mothers and their children, to really looking at protecting nature. And so I was, at this time too, I was reading more and more, becoming more and more distressed about climate change and the kind of great acceleration where you see all those hockey stick graphs where, everything is getting worse quickly, and just exponential, accelerations on all sorts of planetary boundaries. And then I realized that it's actually not just climate change. We're talking about overshoot of a number of ecological boundaries, and that climate change is really just a symptom of all these other problems, and that these problems are a result of our growth. There's so many of us, and we're consuming natural resources, and we're dumping waste, and we're destroying the planet. And this is our home, and we have we have so much to lose. And so the enormity of the crisis really hit me emotionally, and of course, the problems with growth, the problems with fossil fuels, and understanding that green growth has kind of been offered as the solution. We just need to, fix climate change by electrifying everything. But of course, electrifying everything relies on technology, which relies on mining, which is of course more ecological damage, and also electrifying everything is, in terms of emissions, it might be really, really helpful. But I was also really impacted by Professor Vaclav Smil's 4 pillars of modern civilization idea, which he talks about how actually our modern civilization relies on cement, steel, plastics, and ammonia, so fertilizers, and all of those are reliant on fossil fuels. So, emissions, it's not just about transport, it's actually our whole system is out of control, and it's this huge machine that's the problem. So then I was also learning about net energy, which I know that Nathan talked about with you last time, and really that you cannot sort of fix everything. You cannot use technology to fix the multiple systems collapse that we're facing. That electrifying the Titanic is not going to do anything about the multiple icebergs all around us. So that then really brought me to this point of looking around for what other community groups there might be. And interestingly, there was a presentation at Parliament last year, I think it was in June or July, that was organized by the Wise Response organization, and it was called something like Limits to Growth. So I immediately thought, that's what I'm interested in. So I went to this presentation and was so inspired to finally arrive at discussion that was looking at the kind of wider systemic problems. And Mike Joy was somebody who I knew had talked about degrowth. And so I was a bit audacious, and I actually sent him a text message and just said, is there any kind of degrowth something happening in New Zealand? Is there something here, an organization? And he wrote right back and he said, well, there's a few of us who are trying to get something organized, but we need somebody to get on board and coordinate us. Would you do it? And so I was a bit shocked by that, but I had actually also put my thoughts together into a bit of an essay, into an article. So I sent that to Jack Santa Barbara, which was what Mike Joy had recommended that I talk to Jack, and also to Deirdre Kent, because they were the people who were trying to get this Degrowth Aotearoa New Zealand organization kind of up and going. And Jack just immediately wrote back, and I remember his comment so clearly. He said, finally someone who really gets it. So I thought, okay, these are my people. And so we met and formed a bit of a committee. And that was the beginning of my involvement with Dan's. And I guess the real driver for me was this fear of collapse, that the impacts on basic life support systems, from a medical perspective, thinking about what do we do, and food security, what about community cohesion, when, if there's greater disruptions, there's also likely to be greater conflict. And so the focus for me became really clear that we need to rethink our collective priorities. And I think that Mike Joy's got this great analogy that he uses that I just think is perfect. He talks about us being, the sort of pinnacle of the fossil fuel party. And we're all having this great party. There's lots of luxury, and we're having everything that we want. And in fact, we've got this sense of entitlement. And it's like we're these teenagers that are just drunk on fossil fuels. And, at some point the party's going to end, and we're going to have trashed the house. We've got waste everywhere. And And so I guess for me, the degrowth movement is that sense of needing to mature, needing to become adults in this society now, and to take responsibility, to recognize limits and really be aware that there are consequences of what we're doing, to take responsibility, and we need to really reconsider what needs to be done and then to work out how. And we need to focus on sufficiency. We need to learn how to share resources more fairly. We need to focus on qualitative improvements and crisis preparedness. And in some ways, we've learned quite a lot from the pandemic, I think. We saw that by shutting everything down to a much, much slower pace, that in fact we did reduce emissions and people were more relaxed, and we sure worked out who the essential workers are. And I can tell you those lockdowns were certainly hard on some of us. It was horrendous, but we discovered what we need as the kind of basic services. And so that's my background, really.
Fascinating, and certainly very unique in terms of your life experience. And this is what's going to lead us to the conversation we'll have now, because it truly is a very different perspective on life in general. Now, our podcast, the purpose of our podcast is to advocate for change. We acknowledge that there's a big need for change, the way we live, the way we behave. And one of the concepts around the mechanics of how we live is this concept of degrowth. And you've mentioned that already, and it's a conversation we're having more and more about. But degrowth is one of those words that, whilst can also be very aggressive and very off-putting, it can also have various definitions around it, I guess, depending on the perspectives that one has. In your view, what is degrowth? And leading from that, and this is where we can start diving into a little bit more, is how do you see degrowth impacting society in general, the way we live? We've spoken a lot about the mechanics, what we need to do, but what does it actually mean from that perspective?
Yeah, thank you. And this is what I've been just hankering to get to with you guys and more generally. And, there's just this massive upswell of interest. And Jack and I are doing 2 webinars coming up in the next 2 weeks. And so this is the conversation that we need to be having more widely. And starting with the word, Ben, like I think it's a great starting point because it is such a confronting word. Why do we use degrowth? It's really, it's very kind of in your face. And usually there's a bit of a kind of cringe, and people think, why would you talk about anything that's opposing growth? Because, growth is such an important thing. But the place that I've come to with it is that I'm really aligned with the name. And Deirdre wrote an article saying, it's the word to hate and then accept. And I think we need to discuss the deliberate and confronting nature of the name because it is a critique of growth. And Nathan, in his interview with you recently, talked about it. It's a polemic. It's really stating it's against the kind of growthism in our society, which has become a fundamentalist belief system, really fundamentalist. And for many people, it's become easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of growth. So the name is important, and it starts conversations. And certainly, I'm having conversations all the time. I'm getting interrupted by requests for meetings a lot, and in the supermarket or at the post office recently, somebody was asking, not the post office, the bookshop with the post office. 2 young teenagers were asking me about this, what is this degrowth thing? So it's a good starting point. And there are multiple definitions. And I think it's good to just really think about the definition because, it's such a broad movement that the classical definition it's quite long and it's quite technical and it's hard to remember. And so I kind of go with a briefer explanation, which Yorgos Kallis, actually, I like his definition, which is that degrowth refers to a radical political and economic reorganization leading to drastically smaller, much more equitably shared resources and energy use. My own definition of degrowth is that it's a purposeful strategic framework to reduce consumption to achieve social and ecological well-being. But basically, it's an equitable managed reduction of material throughput. And throughput is something that we are talking about a lot because it's not understood very well. And throughput is really the idea that the resources we use, the natural resources, come from nature. They go through the economy and we dump them as waste. So throughput is that movement of resources through the economy and then the kind of spewing out as waste on the other side, which also, damages the environment. But I think, right from the beginning, one of the things that I've learned is that there is this very, very common misunderstanding about degrowth, that it's somehow a recession. If you slow economic growth, then you end up with a recession. And that's, I think, one of the first things that I always want to clarify with people is that degrowth is planned, unlike recession, which is chaotic and socially destabilizing and occurs when growth-dependent economies fail to grow. So degrowth is a planned framework, and that's what makes it, different to recession. But on top of that, in my conversations with different people and different audiences and age groups and stuff, I sometimes resort to the kind of easy ways to describe it, sort of quick phrases, such as an economy that doesn't cost the earth. Or sometimes I refer to the old saying, which is live simply so that others may simply live. Or one of my favorites, which I tease my joy about, which is less stuff, more joy. It's an economy of enough. And it's basically, it really simply basically comes down to that, what we're talking about is quality, not quantity. So the argument for degrowth is that we need to abandon the ideology of constantly pursuing economic growth as something that is good, desirable, necessary, natural, because really it's none of these things. And if we want to stay within planetary limits that make sense, we need to change and transform our economy and how we organize our lives. This is a big, big project, and a lot of it, I think, if you think about sort of having a when to stop rule, it's like we cannot keep growing on this finite planet. And in fact, when you think about our bodies and everything I think about, it always comes through a medical lens, and sometimes I apologize for that, but it's also incredibly useful. It's like, yes, we grow, but then at some point we have the homeostasis in our body that stops growing and we're in a stable state. And so degrowth is really about working out the when to stop rule together based on parameters of sufficiency. And sufficiency is what I've become more passionate about than anything recently, because I think sufficiency is a mechanism that we can relate to. It's like, we need to think about staying within limits. So what is it that we need to have enough? And I think food is another good example for that. It's like, do we really need 20 different options for breakfast? Or can we just have, really high quality porridge, and everyone has their, delicious porridge, but doesn't need 20 different options? So I think there's ways of working this out together where we can, make agreements around what it is that's sufficient. And but degrowth is wider than that too. There's very, very strong values about intergenerational justice and wealth redistribution. And ultimately, it's about reestablishing our relationship to the living world. And for me, the thing that I'm really passionate about is that it's rebuilding a culture of care and relationship, relationship to self and our own emotions and our own sense of sufficiency, enoughism, individually within ourselves, but also relationships with each other and relationships with nature, of course. And what I found really inspiring and kind of reassuring is that when I talk about this stuff, people just get it. It makes sense. And so when we talk about limits to growth, most people don't argue with that, because this stuff does really, it's common sense. And so that's what I think makes it a very powerful movement.
You've mentioned that it's pretty clear that we're living in an inequitable society at the moment. And, it's not just between the global north and the global south, but within countries like New Zealand and Australia, since neoliberalism's really taken hold, the divide between rich and poor, the funneling of wealth, the privatisation of services, cut back on publicly funded support structures, all this kind of stuff, that the systems that are now in place, they have impacts on our societal values. And even if it's been gradual over time and we might not even be aware of it happening, it's now quite wide-reaching, I would argue. Obviously not a sustainable way to live if we want to live within planetary boundaries. And you've already touched on a number of things I think are really kind of key, but what would you love to see start changing quite strongly in terms of our society values? What's truly important that can actually transition this degrowth as quickly as possible?
I know, because it's all about the speed, and I think that what makes our position quite strong is that everything that we're talking about is based on empirical evidence and science, and we are living in a world that is basically, the way I think about it is, it's like our industrialized society has colonized the world. And I think that's what makes New Zealand quite unique too, is that, degrowth thinking is not new to Indigenous people. This is the way that they live. This is their mindset. This is, living within harmony with nature is fundamental to a sense of identity and balance within the community. So how do we bring about, a shift in mindset? I think that's related to what you ask, Emma, isn't it? Yeah. And I think that, we have got such a crisis on our hands. We've got the speed of the crisis. We've also got the scope. This is global. And we've got the scale, which is, everything is at risk. So this is really, really urgent stuff. And again, I kind of come back to my medical sort of experience. It's like if you have somebody who's dying, but you treat them for a broken arm, it's like you're not addressing the whole organism, and you're not responding with the sort of urgency that's needed. And so, I do think that we need to shift mindset as quickly as possible. And the degrowth movement is totally inspiring in the way that it's taking off. I mean, it's not new. The modern version has been around for about 20 years, arising out of Europe. But of course, the Limits to Growth study was published 50 years ago. And yet, in Europe, they've just had this big post-growth conference. And, there were leaders there from political parties, and people are taking notice. And, James Shaw has said that it's time for New Zealand to be having a conversation about degrowth. And so the movement is really big and complex, and so that does mean that there's contradictions and variations, and it is in a constant process of emerging clarity and kind of evolving. And what I've come to realize is that, like most things, it's a continuum. There's degrowth light, which is basically, changing some things and trying to kind of reduce consumption in a kind of minimal way. There's a whole kind of business area that's looking at degrowth. But then on the other end of the continuum is the disaster preparedness. It's like things are going to, there are going to be disruptions, whether it's climate change that's bringing disruptions or energy descent, what you were talking about with Nathan. It's like it is guaranteed that there are going to be disruptions. And so we really need to work out what needs to be done and how. And I guess that brings me to describe our approach from Dan's. And I'd love to just give you a quick overview of the basic concepts and the goals that we're holding. But as I mentioned before, our version is really based on empirical evidence and science, and facing the enormity of the crisis, and Yeah, so shall I talk about the three main goals and some of the priority actions to kind of make it a bit more tangible, perhaps?
Please do.
Yeah. Great. Well, I guess part of the conversation is that, we're hoping to be proactive instead of reactive. We've seen what's happened with Cyclone Gabrielle on the East Coast and flooding in various areas, and Auckland certainly. Ben, I'm sure you've experienced some of the disruptions up there from climate. So we want to sort of have as much of a plan towards expecting these disruptions instead of just constantly having that reactive kind of ambulance at the bottom of the cliff sort of thing. So degrowth goals, for us, we've really looked at sort of three main goals to try and make it as kind of simple and coherent as possible. And the first goal, of course, is this idea of managed reduction of throughput, which I described before, which is the natural resources that go into the economy and then get spewed out as waste on the other end. So we need to reduce drastically, because currently we are about double where we need to be. And so that means, restricting luxury goods and banning destructive substances like artificial fertilizers and forever chemicals. So that kind of managed reduction needs to be, very significant. And so it will likely lead to reduction in GDP. But with the disruptions that are coming, that leads us to our second goal, which is that we need to really plan and think carefully about providing supports for when disruptions become much more felt, individually in our communities. So that means things like really prioritizing universal basic services, so health, housing, food, education, focusing on security and things like universal basic income and reduced working time, guaranteed for work, because of course if you reduce the economic activity, then you're also going to be, needing less work time, but people also need to be guaranteed work. So providing those supports at a community level is a really important goal. The third goal is that, we really need to focus on systemic change to provide the support, to support the transition to what we call a steady state economy. So degrowth is the path, it's about really transforming the way that we organize our lives towards a steady state economy, which is the kind of arrival point where we can be in a kind of homeostasis. It's that when to stop rule. And so systemic changes would include things like rationing fossil fuels, which is the only certain way of controlling emissions. Things like tradable energy quotas, which are not very well known, but we're doing our best to educate, and we've got a petition to, try and get government to consider this. It's an equitable use of fossil fuel that can be reduced year by year, and I'd really love to talk more about that, but probably not tonight. Deirdre Kent is the expert on tradable energy quotas, and I would really recommend that you maybe do a podcast with her. Because it's a fascinating thing to think about. And if it were implemented, it would have a massive impact on controlling emissions. But back to the third goal, systemic changes would also include things like, taxes and redistributing resources and taxing resources and not labor. So that redistribution and having something like a minimum and a maximum income for people, so that you have people, supported, but also that there's a maximum income, and it's not all about just the wealthy getting wealthier. Focusing on community resilience, and of course, resilience means simplification, so core priorities for communities. We've seen some absolutely amazing examples of community response to the cyclone up in Tairāwhiti. Other systemic changes would be things like really ramping up citizens' assemblies, which are democratic ways of making decisions and have been proved really effective in other places. So, that would be another recommendation I would have, is we could talk all about citizens' assemblies. And I think Jack would be a really neat person to talk to about that, because he's got great experience and knowledge about that. But really focusing on, local government, and local governments are connected to their communities. They're much more agile. And it was interesting. I don't know if you guys heard, but on the radio today, they were talking about central government, investing more in local government. And certainly we support that strongly. So, yeah, and then there's things like transitioning from a debt-based money system, which, our current money system depends on growth, so that needs to change too. So those are our three main goals, really. It's the reducing throughput, ensuring that supports are in place, and then working towards systemic change. That's an overview of our approach to degrowth. And the priority actions are really to reprioritize what we use in the economy for essential needs, making sure that basic human needs are met at the community level. As I mentioned before, health services, food security, water, shelter, and building networks. And and with, community action, there's also an impact, in terms of the whole political thing. If people are informed and aware and willing to make changes, and they're much more likely to push politicians and get the kind of top-down changes that we need. And then there's other things as well, like the non-material needs. So degrowth is really focusing a lot on emphasizing our human needs that are non-material. So having more time and investing in relationships, as I mentioned, creativity, having a voice, identity, alternative sources of energy, like really exploring joy and creativity and intimacy and doing things together, sharing, because we're social beings, and we gain enormous satisfaction from connection and doing things together.
Now, you mentioned community resilience. Let's talk a little bit more about that in terms of engaging various communities. How do we bring together the various socioeconomic groups? Because some have had it good, or have it good at the moment, and some are not benefiting as much. And one could say, you said earlier that, Indigenous way of thinking, Indigenous way of living, they've known these principles, but the way society has moved, or first world society has moved through colonialism and so on, is they've all of a sudden become the ones that have lost out effectively in the name of progress, in the name of advancement, and so on. But now we're saying, well, we've had it too good, we need to go back. But how do you bring the two together? Because shouldn't some groups feel, well, hang on, why should we change now when we haven't been the cause of this?
Well, I think that maybe that's another misunderstanding, that degrowth is really talking about the industrialized nations and those of us who are living in industrialized ways. So, as I mentioned before, degrowth thinking is not new to Indigenous people. So the principles of degrowth are already present, and we need to pivot towards their way of being. So we're not asking for those who are living in a balanced way to reduce. Not at all. What we're talking about. And here's another little analogy which I think is really, really helpful. It's like, we are the obese nations, us industrialized societies. So we are the ones who are obese, we are consuming too much, and we need a diet. So we need to reduce our calorific intake. We need to really get healthier in the way that we live. But, other people who are not obese, who are not overweight, do they need a diet? Do children need a diet? It's really about us taking responsibility. We are the overconsumers. And so many of the communities and the people around the world, I'm thinking about my communities in the Pacific, Solomon Islands. What an inspiring group of people. These are villages that are absolutely living in balance. They've got a high life satisfaction. There's a lot of, singing and participating, and degrowth, they don't need this. So it's really for us, and the principles of degrowth that, it's about sustainability and circularity, but it's also things like cooperatives, useful production. We need to focus on what is needed, and not just, useless luxury stuff, local production, and much more emphasis on sharing, sufficiency for all and excess for none. And Jeanette Fitzsimmons talked a lot about, needing to share more fairly, and really focusing more on things like collectives and the commons, even thinking about how do we share resources in terms of property, and commoning is a thing that the degrowth scholars in Europe are talking about a lot. Work-life balance, it's a big part. We need to work less and play more. And I've got a huge thing about playfulness, and how incredibly important it is that we've got playfulness in our lives, and having a sense of, joy that doesn't rely on stuff. So relational goods, less stuff, more relationships. So these are the sort of principles of degrowth that a lot of communities already embrace.
I think the key word there is community. I know with like our chat with Nathan, that was a really important point to drive home, that individual action, while it's admirable, we're not going to achieve the scale of the changes that are necessary without really getting involved in the community and fostering that.
And shifting, I think a really big thing for me is shifting the mindset away from this hyper individualism. We've been driven to believe that we want to be independent, and it's all about me and my success and my progress, and shifting into a mindset of collectivism. We need each other. And in fact, contributing is so satisfying. Doing something to enable someone else and, to see them flourish is deeply satisfying. So I think a lot of degrowth thinking is a lot about shifting to a collectivism and a mindset based on the values that are away from the individual, is kind of this very, it's a limited way of seeing things. And actually, I think when you look at our society now, that this growth-based society, it's, yes, we've got a bigger economy than ever before, but we've also got, higher mental health problems and, loneliness. I think the US has recently developed this kind of loneliness commission or something similar. And, our health issues are worse. We've got higher rates of obesity. It's like this growthism. You can see it from the micro to the macro. And so, having a bigger economy, is it really serving us? Another thing that I sometimes talk about is this little phrase that I love, which is, that some people are so poor that all they have is money. And I think, the poverty of this society, our sense of isolation and deep depression, and are those signs of a healthy society? Big economy, but I think we really need to rethink what our meaning is in life. Yeah.
So where do we start? We say it a lot. We're not going to wait for politicians, governments. We're not going to wait for corporates. We're not going to wait for the supposed leaders.
Yeah.
Where do we start? And usually I'll say as individuals, but we agree as communities. How do we initiate this? What are the first steps we should be taking?
We go to a degrowth conference.
Nice little segue there.
I just love what you guys are doing. It is so important to be having these conversations. And I remember last year when I started with Dan's, I remember thinking, oh my God, what can we do? Where do we start, Ben? The problem is so enormous. And I thought, okay, here's my objective. The one thing that maybe I can influence. And I thought, I need to be realistic. And so I thought, well, what about just thinking about, my goal is to get degrowth into the national conversation. And you know what? 6 months later, There are so many news articles being published. There's a webinar that I've been invited to that Gareth Hughes is organizing with James Shaw, our climate minister. He wants to talk about degrowth. So we are getting this into the national conversation. And mindset shift. This is the big thing. It's like, okay, action, yes, but actually we need to be shifting the mindset around where the priorities are. It's not just climate change. That's what we've been focused on for such a long time. And now people are starting to get their heads around overshoot. Climate change is just one little narrow part of this much bigger, wider, multi-systems problem. And so it's waking people up to, okay, the solutions that we thought were going to work are not working. And so we need to think differently. And then once we start thinking differently, then it's like, well, how do we act differently? And so, things like, individual action is of course part of that. And I could talk for ages about, voluntary simplicity. And, we live in a tiny house, and, I bike everywhere. I've gotten away from my car, and the joy of that, the individual satisfaction of living slower and more simply, and then connecting with other people who are doing that too, who are like, yeah, man, this system is not working. We want to live differently, but we need systemic changes to enable that, because of course not everyone has the privilege. So talking about it, getting it into the national conversation, and then of course there's influencing decision makers to reprioritize things. That's all part of DANS, and so we are organizing this conference to bring people together and in a collaborative way work out what we need to do to influence systemic change, but also how we can help businesses be far more degrowth minded, so that profit is not so much the imperative, but rather supporting people, the whole kind of social enterprise idea, and collectives, and certainly the tiny house movement is something I'm really passionate about. So there's actually a lot that can be done from the individual all the way to the entire society. But it starts with awareness and priorities.
Taking action can actually be the easy part. It's exactly what you say. It's a change in mindset. That's the hard bit, because often we can volunteer for things. We can say, I need to do a bit of this, I need to do a bit of that, but we don't actually change that mindset. Then it's just token, and it's only one small component of the bigger picture. So like you say, conversations are hugely important. You have repeated so many times in your conversations around the importance of community, the cohesive approach. And that's where conversations are had, right? Sharing ideas, sharing success stories. And that's exactly what you've brought to this conversation, which we're so immensely grateful for. Like you say, it's you've said this right at the start. It's unconventional. It's a different approach, but it's what I call the softer approach. We have looked a lot at the mechanics of degrowth, what it means. We look at energy systems, and it's all the complicated science stuff. But hang on, there's the social aspect that we often forget. It's the social side of things that usually gets the most impacted. And if you don't acknowledge that, it'll be hard to implement change on a grand scale. So the perspective and the views that you've shared from your immensely fascinating journey that you've had as through your life, through your life has been is an asset. We need more people like you to front up and lead. So thank you for sharing such wonderful. I mean, we could have a 3-4 hour conversation, like you say, so many other aspects we can delve into, but a really thoughtful or thought-provoking, actually, conversation. So thank you for that, Sahra.
Yeah, well, and I think, like, even in the small things that we do, I think if we really think about the things that bring us deep satisfaction, this is something that each one of us can take a moment to sort of think about. Often when you think about those times in your life when you felt real satisfaction, not just the kind of spike of happiness, which is often, a transient thing, but deep satisfaction often is about non-material things. So it's about those times when you are in connection with your family and your friends, and doing things together, or, you know, tasks that you may have accomplished that were really challenging, but, you know, probably really meaningful for you or for someone else, you know, maybe a task that you did that contributed to somebody else's well-being. You know, those are the priorities that I think are very much, Nathan and I often talk about sort of 21st century thinking. It's like we're really starting to see that the myth of our society, you know, we've been told so many things that are actually not helpful, and we really need to rediscover, you know, what is it really to have a meaningful life. And a lot of that is to do with, you know, the sufficiency and the simplicity of feeling like, you know, you're connected, and you're not constantly chasing this sort of illusion and on this treadmill of trying to kind of get bigger, but really having your needs met and the security of that. And we need a system that enables that for everyone. So with our conference, can I talk about that for a quick minute?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's been quite a, I guess this was, you know, for me personally, it was like, how do we broaden our movement? How do we help people to come together to think about the action, you know, and how do we spread the kind of the passion that we have for a new way of living? Because I guess one thing that I've heard a lot in the conversations that I've had is that people are really tired from like this sense of constantly fighting against something. It's like we've had our climate marches, you know, and nothing has really changed. And we've signed petitions, and we've written, and we've done all this stuff to try and kind of fight against the system. But part of what I think really inspires people is that degrowth offers something to fight for. It's like we want to live more simply. We want to live more connectedly. It's like this is the vision that is actually inspiring. And it's not just fighting against something, it's fighting for something. And it's a vision of a way of living that actually could really be far, far more, in balance. And, you know, we're also talking about time horizons. I think so much of our thinking is short-term, you know, election cycles and, you know, the next sort of 5 years, or Paris Climate Accord, you know, the next 10 years or whatever. But, you know, if you think about your time horizon sort of 50 years from here, you know, that really brings me back to my role as a midwife. You know, I think what really powered me into needing to take on more action and get more involved is that with every birth that I was attending, I was thinking about the future of that child. You know, and I kept thinking, you know, our ambitions, you know, politically and stuff, they seem so short-sighted. And, you know, what if our time horizon is 50 years from now? You know, would we really be behaving that we are like we are now? So, yeah, so earlier this year, I thought, what can I do with dance now? And I thought, okay, time for a national event. We need to bring people together to share ideas, because we don't know a lot of this. You know, this is all new. And people, you know, ask me, well, what should we do? And I think, well, we don't have all the answers. We are working this out together. And so we need to collaborate, and we really need to have an opportunity to learn from each other and come up with projects that we can share, because it's much easier to do things together and far more fun than trying to battle all this stuff through on your own. So I thought, right, okay, a national event conference in September, and it's just exploded. And I hope that we can really pull it off, because I think it's a great opportunity. It will be at Victoria University in Wellington. And we've got 2 days. It's on a weekend, and 16th, 17th of September. Day one is kind of organized as a day of looking at systemic issues and, just the kind of bigger picture. And day two is looking at flax roots, community, you know, action. So day one is top down. Day two is bottom up. So just to give you a quick little overview, on day one, we've got Nate Hagans, who you guys might be familiar with from The Great Simplification. And a lot of your listeners might be familiar with his fantastic podcast, which gives just probably one of the best overviews in terms of our situation and the wider crisis, and also some amazing leaders and responses to our situation. So Nate Hagens will join us on day one, probably with a recording, because I think he's going to be on a flight that day between Sweden and the US. So we've got a special presentation from Nate Hagens, then we've got a presenter from Barcelona, which is where the Degrowth headquarters are. It's where the university is and where all the thought leaders in Europe are coming out. So we'll have a guest speaker from Barcelona. Then we've got a session which I'm really excited about, which is talking about the interface between Te Ao Maori and degrowth and what we can learn from them, and really just, again, recognizing that, New Zealand is based on Te Tiriti, and we are absolutely in partnership here with Maori, and we want to learn and share ideas. So we've got a great session there. And then we've got, a panel discussion probably looking at how to mainstream the movement, and also another panel looking at futures thinking and a real focus on sufficiency. I talked about the concept of sufficiency before, so we want to think about that as a mechanism in government. If we organize our policies and the direction that the government takes across parties, what would happen if we really frame that around concepts of sufficiency? Would that be a mechanism for actually influencing policy change? And then that evening we'll have a social event where people can talk and share and hang out and enjoy each other. And then on day two, it will be things like, the universal basic services I talked about, the health and the housing and transport, also business, things like, tool libraries and tool sharing and, zero waste businesses, the focus on food and food security, and, container repair schemes, those sort of community initiatives. We'll have some great presenters talking about that, maybe some stalls where people can mingle and talk about those sort of community initiatives. And then we also want to touch just briefly on the psychological and emotional. So, if we think about that kind of macro to micro, it's like, yes, we've got society and all the structural, systemic things to be thinking about. And then we've got the community side of things. But then, there's also the individual. And in our individual lives, a lot of us are having to confront grief and facing into the enormity of the future and the crisis that we live in. And, how do we move forward when we're in a place of real concern? And for many people, it's, engaging with that sense of despair and finding ways of being real about it, but also sharing inspiration and coming to a point of acknowledging the emotional. I often think about the cycles of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talked about. Initially there's the kind of bargaining, and I think that's where we're at in our society. It's like, yeah, sure, green growth is going to fix this. We're in the bargaining phase, right? And then there's the anger phase, and then there's the grief phase, and then, ultimately we come to acceptance. And what happens when we come to that point of acceptance and the agency that we can find from that place, and we can perhaps be empowered from a place of acceptance to really reevaluate what's important and what's meaningful. And so that will be the final part of our conference, is really looking at the individual emotional side and the importance around connection and care and relationships.
So there you have it, Beyond Growth Aotearoa, 16th, 17th of September at Victoria University in Wellington. We'll have the links in the show notes, and we'll certainly promote it separately as well. We certainly encourage a lot to attend, especially those of you already in Wellington. Ride a bike, take the public transport, get there, and learn, and then take that back to your communities. Sahra, thank you. It's been a fascinating chat. We really hope in the future to have you back on the show to share more. But best of luck with this conference, Degrowth conference. I think it's going to be the first of many important conversations to be had in our greater community. So thank you so much for coming onto the show. We really appreciate it.
Great. Yeah, and it is the first of many events. We're hoping to have follow-on events and workshops, and, this is just the beginning, as you say. And I would just flag it for our listeners as well that, if you want to learn more, we've got a really good website, Degrowth NZ. People can have a look there. Fantastic resources, a whole lot more information. So this conversation, it's been absolutely delightful, but it's also really just the tip of the wider story. So thank you again for everything that you're doing, both of you.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.